So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. It's very nice to see the big number of participants, which actually shows the great interest there is in this important topic. Today, we will launch a report by Export Economics, the socio-economic impact of second-hand clothes in Africa, EU, and UK. This is a comprehensive analysis commissioned by Humana People to People and Sympany. And it is the first of its kind to examine the value chain's social economic impacts and policies, shaping the industry in the EU and UK, and the three African countries, Ghana, Kenya, and Mozambique. So just some short background numbers. Global textile production is estimated to be responsible for about 20% of global clean water pollution, and is estimated to be responsible for 10% of global carbon emissions. EU launched the Green Deal in 2019, and textiles became one of the priorities, publishing the strategy for sustainable and circular textile in 2022, aiming to make the sector sustainable and climate neutral, focusing on the environmental aspect of the sector. So this report fills a critical research gap, increasing our understanding of the second-hand clothing sector's substantial contributions beyond the environmental impacts. It highlights how the circular textile industry drives sustainable economic growth, fosters green job creation, and alleviates poverty. The findings illustrate that this sector generates billions in GDP across Europe and Africa, while supporting thousands of green jobs throughout the value chain. The timing of this report is crucial, with major legislative changes on the horizon, including new frameworks for textile collection taking effect in 2025, and conclusive EU discussion on the Waste Framework Directive. Our industry stands at a crossroads. The upcoming decision will profoundly shape the future of second-hand clothes sector. Our main objective with this report is to help stakeholders to understand the true nature of the second-hand sector, an industry that generates economic benefits and contributes to poverty alleviations. Today, the second-hand clothes industry in Europe is collecting around 25% of the apparel sold on the European market. And we aim to showcase how our industry can be transparent, efficient, and scalable, playing a significant role in the transition of the sector. So through a well-established value chain connecting the global north and global south, our sector efficiently channels used clothing to where it's most needed, particularly in regions with high demand of affordable quality garments, respecting clear quality criteria of the products. Achieving the EU's green policy goals and supporting sustainable development in Africa requires that governments and policymakers design supportive legislation to enable the growth of the sector to manage the transition to global circular textile economy. So, before we delve into the report findings, let me briefly outline today's agenda. So I think you get it on the screen. So we will start with an introduction by Johan Junkind from Sympany. After, we will hear Johanna Neuhoff from Export Economics, will present the key findings of the report. Finally, we will have a panel discussion on the role of the second-hand clothes sector in sustainable development, featuring speakers from Europe, UN Trade and Development, the Ghana Used Clothes Dealers Association, and Copenhagen Business School. And we will finish with the Q&A to address your questions. So please leave your comments in the Q&A chat, and we will make sure to address some of them during this time. This webinar is going to be recorded, and we can share it with all of you after the event. So I'm very pleased to present and introduce Johan Junkind from Sympany, who will open the session with insights on the second-hand clothes sector and the fundamental role of the non-profit organizations playing in promoting sustainability, accessibility throughout the global textile value chain. Thank you, and have a nice, interesting webinar.
Yeah, Thank you, Corina, for this introduction, and welcome everybody. Also, on behalf of Sympany, everybody a warm welcome. To introduce ourselves to everybody in the meeting, we are a Dutch NGO that focuses on sustainable closed-loop post-consumer textile researches and projects. For Sympany, this is an important report, as social economic factors have always been an important part in our decisions. We always ensure that our working conditions, our projects, are in line with the OECD guidelines. But as a foundation, we have a much wider look than just profit. We also select our partners based on various social economic factors. And over the years, Sympany was founded in 1987. We adhere to and we value these criteria. But these criteria have always been our professional opinions, personal observations. And now with this research that Oxford Economics has done, it's good to have an external party to investigate this. So we will learn more about employment, the employment that our industry provides, and the income that it generates for people, and about the working conditions. For us here at Sympany, this report is not an endpoint, but actually it's more of a starting point. It allows us to make much better informed decisions in a global textile market, which is very, very complex and changing quite a lot at the moment. So thank you for joining us. And I would like to introduce now our next speaker from Oxford Economics. That's Johanna Neuhoff.
Thanks a lot. So I'll start to share my presentation. Just have to make sure. All right, so let's start with the main findings. I have to start a bit with the objectives and the methods we used for this study, because I think it helps you to understand what we have actually done. While the environmental benefits of the secondhand clothing industry are quite well known, the secondhand industry's socioeconomic benefits were less explored, and that's where our report comes in. We as Oxford Economics carried out a study commissioned by Humana People to People and Sympany, and we analyzed the secondhand clothing's socioeconomic impacts in the EU and the United Kingdom and 3 selected African countries, Ghana, Kenya, and Mozambique. And we used a multi-method approach to produce internally consistent and comparable results, checking our assumptions carefully with stakeholders and official data available. And as a result, we believe that our findings offer the most reliable estimations of the secondhand clothing industry's socioeconomic footprint to date. We studied the industry using a very rigorous and well-known economic modeling approach that maps the economic impact according to the contribution to the gross to the GDP and to employment. And as a result of this rigorous concept we followed throughout the research, our estimates tend to be on the conservative side of the spectrum of findings from the literature. And therefore, we think they should provide the go-to reference for the socioeconomic footprinting of the secondhand clothing industry. So the first thing I personally learned when we started to do the study is that, in contrast to common belief, every step of the secondhand clothing industry's value chain involves financial transactions, such as paying workers, buying and selling clothes, and covering shipment costs. And we have highlighted these several and complex steps into a stylized value chain that involves several key stages. It starts with individuals in the global north discarding used clothes at collection points. This is the gray icon on the left-hand side. And then these points are managed by collection companies, the dark blue icon, and they collect the clothes and sell them to specialized sorting centers. In the sorting stage, represented by the light blue icon, the textiles are categorized based on potential for reuse, recycling, or disposal in accordance with the waste hierarchy. Sorting centers in the EU27 identify mainly 4 categories: clothes for retail in Europe, for markets in the global south, non-reusable textiles for recycling, and clothes that cannot be repurposed. Then reusable clothes are either sold within the EU27+ or shipped to the Global South. So if reusable items stay in the EU27+, they are sold through various outlets, including commercial shops and not-for-profit organizations. This is the green icon on the left-hand side. If they enter the Global South, so we are on the right-hand side of the chart now, in the Global South, the sorted clothes are bought by wholesalers, this yellow icon, who further categorize the secondhand clothing bales and distribute them to formal retail shops and informal market traders. And in countries like Ghana, Kenya, and Mozambique, over 80% of secondhand clothing is sold in informal markets. Informal retailers usually buy clothing bales from wholesalers, adding value by washing, ironing, restyling, tailoring, and repairing clothes. They also distribute these clothes to remote areas, ensuring broad accessibility to affordable clothing. So at a very fundamental level, if you look at the value chain, the sector takes garments that were previously owned by someone else and redirects them to their new owners where there is demand, whether domestically or internationally. So that also ensuring that these items stay in circulation instead of becoming waste. So I have mentioned the rigorous economic impact modeling approach, and I would like to introduce you to it. Please be aware that this captures specifically the secondhand clothing industry's effects on the formal economy. By prolonging the lifespan of garments, the secondhand clothing industry generates important direct contributions to the region's economies by employing staff, by generating gross value added, and contributing taxes to the authorities. However, the economic footprint of the industry extends far beyond its direct economic activity. Why? The secondhand industry engages a wide range of third-party suppliers. These suppliers provide, for example, transportation, they provide warehouses or office spaces, etc. So to provide these services, the secondhand industry suppliers in turn have their own suppliers, meaning that the industry stimulates substantial economic activity throughout the whole supply chain. And this is what we call the indirect effect. Furthermore, the wages paid to employees in the secondhand clothing industry and by suppliers along its supply chain flow into the wider economy. Employees spend their earnings on goods and services across a variety of sectors, for example, housing or food or healthcare. And this expenditure contributes as well to additional economic value and supports further employment in various industries. And this is what we call the induced impact. And all impacts summed up together is what we are calling the industry's total impact. And to get to a point to reliably estimate these impacts, we used a variety of information and methods that you can see listed at the right-hand side of the slide. Everything to double-check results and hypotheses and make sure that our analysis provides as reliable results as possible. And the most crucial ones were a quantitative survey with firms on each step of the value chain I just showed on the previous slide, qualitative observations and fieldwork in the 3 African countries we studied, interviews with local politicians and industry experts, as well as data validation workshops, especially in the Global South. So let's dive into the key findings, as Corina has promised you. In the EU27+, the secondhand clothing industry has a substantial positive socioeconomic impact. In 2023, the year we studied, it directly contributed 3 billion euros to the GDP. So the direct effects are shown in this dark blue on the slide. Additionally, the industry generates significant employment in the EU27+, and with the industry facilitating the collection of textile waste and the sorting of reusable materials from waste streams, the industry specifically creates green jobs for its employees. Thus, the secondhand industry supported a minimum of 110,000 green jobs in the EU27+ in 2023. The total economic contribution far exceeds its direct impact, as I just showed you in the impact modeling framework, including its indirect and induced effects. In 2023, the industry supported an estimated total contribution of 7 billion euros to the GDP in the EU27 plus. Similarly, the industry also supported a total employment of around 150,000 jobs in 2023. Moreover, the second-hand clothing industry generated wider socioeconomic impacts in the EU27 plus to consider. For example, in the EU countries that we studied, the average gross income of the industry's employees in each country was on average around 12% higher than the respective national minimum wage. And what is more, the industry generated substantial job opportunities in less economically developed regions of the EU27 plus. We estimate that 20% of the industry's direct employment contribution are generated in Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland, which are the countries with the lowest GDP per capita in the EU in 2023. And lastly, the European second-hand clothing industry also fosters equal paid female employment opportunities. Women make up around 80% of its workforce, and there is no reported difference in pay between men and women. And 77% of the industry's employees only have a basic intermediate educational background compared to 60% in the overall workforce in the EU27 plus. And this highlights that the second-hand clothing industry provides accessible job opportunities for which the formal education requirements are rather modest. So I've just shown you the impact of the second-hand clothing industry in the EU27 plus for the entire second-hand clothing industry. And now we look at the 3 African countries, but we only consider the effect of the second-hand trade between the EU27 plus and our 3 countries. So not the overall second-hand clothing imports. Plus, we only look at imports directly exported to these countries from the EU and the UK. While we know that countries in the Middle East serve as intermediaries for European exports to these countries, we again wanted to depend on the most reliable yet conservative estimates. So the socio-economic impact of second-hand clothing trade between the EU27 plus and Ghana, Kenya, and Mozambique generated substantial positive economic impacts in the 3 African countries. And the total effect produced in the formal economy is really impressive, especially considering the high relevance of the informal sector in these economies. So let's dive into the 3 countries. Ghana imported overall 54,000 tons of second-hand clothing directly from the EU27 plus in 2023. And the total socioeconomic contribution of these imports across all 3 channels of impact was approximately $76 million. Moreover, the EU27 plus trade with Ghana supported 22,000 formal jobs. And in addition, we estimate that around 43,000 jobs in the informal economy of Ghana have been supported by the second-hand clothing imports from the EU27 plus as well. And lastly, the formal part of the industry contributed $38 million to the treasury of Ghana. Overall, these are, if you look at the slide, the biggest impacts because the share of EU27 plus imports are highest in Ghana, and the share of the formal employment in the wholesale and retail sector in Ghana is around 25%, so also on the higher end. In Kenya, while only accounting for 13% of the second-hand clothing imports, in the second-hand clothing trade between Kenya and the EU27 plus provided a total GDP contribution of around $24 million and supported around 6,300 formal jobs. As Kenya has a very big informal economy, up to 68,000 additional informal jobs can be added to the bill. And finally, $23 million in tax revenues have been supported, which is equivalent to 0.1% of the tax revenue collected in Kenya in the fiscal year 22-23. And this is especially surprising as only 5% of the wholesale and retail sector in Kenya are part of the formal economy. In Mozambique, we estimated that the EU27 plus exports supported a total GDP contribution of $11 million and 5,700 formal jobs. Moreover, we think that around 15,000 jobs could be supported in the informal sector, accounting for a share of 7% formal employees in Mozambique. And although only 18% of Mozambique's secondhand clothing imports stem from the EU27 plus, according to UN Comtrade, the industry still contributed $11 million to the national budget, around 0.2% of Mozambique's tax revenue in 2022. Across all three countries, we also found that the formal industry enables full-time workers to earn living wages in Ghana, Kenya, and Mozambique, and the industry pays formal employees wages well above the poverty line. In the informal sector, most of our interviewees reported that the secondhand clothing traders earn enough money to send their children to school and pay for other necessities. However, employees of these informal traders, especially that ones working part-time, cannot rely on their earnings in the secondhand clothing industry as sole income. Given the informality of their work, informal employees do not benefit from minimum wages and other protections provided in local labor laws. And this supports the hypothesis that employment in the formal economy is more reliable and better supports income security. From a consumer perspective, one of the leading social benefits of the secondhand clothing industry is that it allows affordable access to quality clothing. The affordability of secondhand clothing is the leading source of the growing demand. Approximately 86% of the interviewed customers of secondhand clothing traders in Kenya, Mozambique, and Ghana agreed that the leading reason for purchasing secondhand clothing is their affordability. Furthermore, many perceive the quality to be better than that of new clothing, with 68% of interviewed customers mentioning that the quality of secondhand clothing is better than available new clothes. A threat to the secondhand clothing industry in the Global South is that the ultimate disposal of used clothing items after being worn reduces the industry's overall environmental benefits. Even though recent studies by Circle Economy have revealed that only a relatively small fraction of secondhand imports can be considered waste, so around 4%, countries importing secondhand clothing have to handle the clothes disposal at the end of the life. And as the countries studied often rely on the inadequate waste management infrastructure, the secondhand clothing traders' ability to properly dispose of possible textile waste is, of course, affected. Although the issue of textile and clothing waste is much broader than the secondhand trade alone, the industry provides a unique opportunity to reduce the problem by enhancing reuse and environmentally sustainable solutions for the disposal of end-of-life clothing. The sector is also well aligned with sustainability policies and climate targets in both Europe and Africa. The secondhand clothing sector supports several sustainable development goals, such as reducing poverty, combating climate change, empowering women who make up a significant portion of the workforce, and promoting overall development. As I have limited time, please refer to the report or the QA document if you want to find out more and how we map this to the SDGs, but I still wanted to make sure I mentioned this. Based on our analysis, we created a SWOT analysis for both the Global North and the Global South. While I can't go into the details, this analysis was crucial in developing our policy recommendations. These recommendations aim to leverage strength and capture opportunities, address weaknesses, and mitigate threats to future-proof the secondhand industry. Let's start with the three main recommendations that we recommend policymakers in the Global North to consider if they want to strengthen the secondhand clothing industry. Firstly, policymakers in the Global North should be aware that regulations imposed in the Global North can have impacts on the functioning global network of the secondhand clothing industry. You've seen how the value chain is global in nature. Thus, policies made in and for the global north can have unintended impacts in the global south as well, and these should be considered. By preventing used textiles from ending up in landfills, the second-hand clothing industry is pivotal in achieving EU policy goals, especially concerning circularity. So one major key to support the industry in this endeavor is to implement and enforce the EPR schemes for textiles by holding producers financially responsible for the end-of-life management of their products. The reuse of textiles, even of lesser overall quality, could become financially viable. And research from the Joint Research Center of the EU have already claimed that the profitability of the second-hand clothing industry is at risk if they need to collect and sort common house textile waste without getting financially reimbursed. By establishing clear and stringent guidelines,
I think we have some technical issues for the moment. We are just trying to work on it, and I hope Johanna will be very, very fast back. Do we have any? That is good to see you, Johanna.
I'm sorry. I'm back now. So I think I recognize when I left you, but let me restart the last slide. So really bad timing.
Well, it can happen. Technique is technique. So welcome back, and just take the last part again, and just so we connect.
Exactly. So let me check that I also.
Yeah. Now we can see it again.
Great, perfect.
Super. Thank you.
So I think you still heard the recommendations for the policymakers. So I would like to highlight the ones for the businesses and not-for-profit organizations in the global north again. So businesses and not-for-profit organizations in the global north should develop integrated partnerships within the supply chain for streamlined operations. And this enhanced coordination between the actors can ensure efficient matching of supply and demand, reduce waste, and improve the overall profitability of businesses within the second-hand clothing markets, in our view. For the Global South, reducing import duties on second-hand clothing would increase affordability for lower income groups and reverse ineffective tariffs or bans that have not significantly benefited local textile manufacturing in the past. And more than 80% of wholesalers we interviewed named the high import costs as the main challenges for the local second-hand clothing industry. Investments by governments and businesses in the Global South in recycling and waste management infrastructure, along with the establishment of sorting and processing centers in the Global South, would not only reduce environmental and public health risk, but also create jobs and stimulate economic growth. businesses could better manage quality control and supply-demand matching, while partnerships with local recycling firms, for example, could help repurpose unwanted textiles. Lastly, in addition, establishing associations for informal retailers could better coordinate the market, providing vocational training to retailers, equipping them with skills to boost profitability, and maybe also providing incentives to become part of the formal economy. Thank you so much. And again, very sorry for my internet issues, but I hope, you heard everything.
Thank you, Johanna, for the presentation. We will now move forward to our panel, the role of second-hand clothing sector in sustainable development. So first of all, I would like to ask all the panelists to turn on their camera so that we could see you. Perfect. So, hello everyone. My name is Ece Şanlı and I lead circular economy at Humana People to People. As the project manager of the impact study, I will be moderating today's discussion. We have a diverse group of stakeholders represented by our valuable panelists. And before we start, I would like to introduce them to you. First, we have Enrique Pacini from UN Trade and Development. Enrique is a member of the leadership team of the Sustainable Manufacturing and Environmental Pollution SMEP program by the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and UN Trade and Development. With extensive experience in reducing pollution in trade export sectors, including textiles across Africa and Asia, Enrique is an expert on how policies can impact sustainability. Welcome, Enrique. Next, we have Philippe Doliget from EURIC. At EURIC, the leading voice for a competitive European recycling industry, Philippe is in charge of overseeing the work of EURIC Textiles, aiming at promoting the collective interests of the European textile recycling and reuse industries. Welcome, Philippe. Next, we are joined by Marlwin Owusu from Ghana Used Clothing Dealers Association, where he's an executive member. As the second generation leader in his family's used clothing business, he aims to highlight the vital role the second-hand clothing industry plays in advancing sustainability and generating significant socioeconomic benefits. Welcome, Marlwin. Last but not least, Peter Lund Thompson from Copenhagen Business School is with us today. Peter's research focuses on economic, social, and environmental impacts of international trade between the global North and South, with over 20 years of expertise in corporate social responsibility and sustainability within global value chains, particularly in the garment, textile, and leather industries. Welcome, Peter. In the interest of time, we kindly ask that each intervention be kept to a maximum of 3 minutes. If you exceed the time, I will have to intervene to keep us on track. And for those of you watching the launch online, we greatly value your input in this discussion. Please feel free to add any questions to the chat at any time. There will be a dedicated Q&A session with our panelists and Joanna at the end. So let's dive into our panel discussion now. Philippe, let's start with you. The report highlights that in 2023, the second-hand clothing industry contributed to 7 billion euros to the EU27 plus economy, with 110,000 direct jobs created, many of which are in green sectors like textile waste management. How do you see this contribution growing in the coming years, especially in the context of the EU Green Deal and the push for a circular economy?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ece, for this question, and again, thank you for the invitation to this panel discussion on a very important topic for us, because as you presented myself and EURIC Textiles, like most of our members are reuse operators and also secondhand clothes operators, especially also exporting clothes to not just all over Europe, but also to Africa and other continents all over the world. So the figures you mentioned, these are super important figures at EU level, and it really demonstrates the amount of green jobs that are created thanks to the secondhand clothes industry. But I would like to raise awareness really in the short term of the current crisis situation that the reuse secondhand clothes sector in Europe is facing. Because although the figures that you mentioned are quite positive, I would say that in the short term, I would not be very optimistic, let's say, because of the crisis that we are facing. Like the prices for secondhand textiles at the moment have crashed, have really dropped, and the costs of collection, sorting, and recycling have really increased very recently. So there is the risk of companies in the near future that can file bankruptcies. So while those figures are really good for the moment, I mean, we really need the sector to be supported in the short term. And so what we are advocating for in order to keep the positive development and to have this circular transition is really for the EU to stick to its circular economy agenda, to fully implement the textile strategy of 2022 and to do more in the short term. So to have a swift agreement on the targeted revision of the Waste Framework Directive first. So we hope that there will be an agreement by the end of the year. And most importantly, to set up EPR schemes for textiles actually quite quickly, because we really need this in order for all the reuse, secondhand operators and recycling operators to survive, let's say. What should also be done is really to tackle the rise of the ultra fast fashion. So especially the Chinese ultra fast fashion platforms that are invading the market and which pose a direct challenge and competition for the secondhand clothes. It also has an impact on the quality of the collected textiles at the end of the day, with the quality that tends to decrease over time. So here the question is also, what is the future for the reuse industry then? Because if the quality of the clothes that you collect is decreasing, then the quality of the secondhand clothes that you will sell will also decrease, actually. So here there is a question that we will need to ask ourselves. And also we need to consider the separate collection of textiles, as you mentioned, as of January 2025. Here as well, we will see probably an increase in volumes of textiles collected, which is good in principle, but at the same time, probably the quality of the textiles collected will also probably decrease, which will mean also less revenues for the sorting facilities. So what we would need in the future is just for the reuse sector to grow. So to improve eco-design requirements, for example, to increase the demand for recycled textiles.
Sorry, Philip, apologies for the interruption. I think you're touching on very important topics and we will be covering them later in the panel, but for the interest of time, I will now move to the next panelist. But thank you, Philip. So now moving to Enrique, I'd like to ask you about the SMEP program. UN Trade and Development is leading the SMEP program, which focuses on reducing environmental pollution through sustainable manufacturing practices, particularly in the developing countries. What are the preliminary results you have gathered? And what synergies do you see between SMEP's results and the finding of this report in terms of promoting cleaner, more sustainable second-hand clothing trades?
Thank you, Eche, for inviting UN Trade and Development, UNCTAD, to participate in this webinar. The second-hand clothes sector is one of 5 areas of work that the SMEP program has. By the way, SMP stands for Sustainable Manufacturing and Environmental Pollution, sponsored by the UK. We also work on batteries, tanneries, organic waste, and a number more. Their goal is to prevent pollution, of course, in trade-exposed sectors. I'm going to answer your question with a few visual slides. Now, promise to be very quick here. Just confirm you can see the screen. Yeah.
Yes, we do see it.
Perfect. Okay, so we have been probing a bit. Well, we have an analytical track to examine second-hand clothes market, especially their socioeconomic impact, values, and the issue of waste, right? Whether how much waste there is, the big question that has been raised. and we probed the markets of Uganda and Tanzania. By the way, the full cycle consultancy performed most of the field work. Very big kudos to them. And the intervention of UNCTAD of the SMAP program on second-hand clothes, it's also backed by a physical intervention by Wasted UK, which is actually working on the ground with machinery to give capital capacity for operators on the field, trading second-hand clothes, to upgrade any leftover material into useful products. So there's more information I can share on the program, smapprogram.org. There's a full description of our physical intervention there. So I think what is worth saying that we looked at a large number of samples of clothes in the markets. In case of Uganda, it was a window market. In case of Tanzania, we looked at Yala, Kariakoo, and Karume markets. We cannot extrapolate to the entire country, but it was significant. Those are significant markets, trading second-hand clothes in those places. And we also looked at various importers to do interviews. So interestingly, the clothing depends a lot on the origin. So the clothing coming from China is a little bit cheaper in terms of kilograms, price per kilogram, than clothing come from Europe. We probe here the United Kingdom. So they're just connecting with what was discussed before in the presentations. It's important to keep the import process affordable, because the traders tend to prefer destinations or origins that allow them to buy cheaper clothes. We've been also asking the stakeholders on the ground, what is really the factors that determine the quality of clothes for them? And they mention appearance, condition, fashion, functionality, and especially appearance and condition as the key criteria for quality of clothes. And here you can see a bit what would be a grade A category range, meaning appearance level 5, grade B, appearance level 4, and so on. We're trying to play around a bit to understand from a bottom up, like word of the market, interview-based perspective, what a grading criteria for quality would be. One interesting factor is that the main factor to downgrade clothing quality from into like lower categories, like rags, fagia, which is the least valuable, still usable clothing, and rags, which is just near waist, is their appearance and condition of those pieces. I mean, this is coming from the market themselves, right? I think this is quite interesting too. We are trying to probe the distribution of pieces by pricing. So how much of the bale, of type of bale you get of $1 per piece or $2 per piece, and you see that there's a price point here. Like you can understand that most things are sold up to a $6 per piece price.
Enrique, thank you.
So,
we're also running a bit of the 3-minute gap.
Yes.
Would you like to hurry, or would you like to...
Absolutely. No, this just to show that it's quite interesting when you look at the breakdown of data in those markets. You see that you can actually see what is a premium cloth based on the price, what is a rag or a ronya, like a lower value item. But the key information here is that the amount of waste it seems to be very small in those markets. Most products find a willing buyer, and they have usefulness. So within about approximately 5% of the contents of a bale is considered to be a lower value item, which will not fit the trade code for worn clothing 630910. So there is a little bit of waste, but it's quite small, and most products actually find a willing buyer. And the socioeconomic consequences that are very important, especially in terms of affordability. I think our Oxford Economics presentation presented it all. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrique. They are very useful insights, and thank you for sharing them with us. Now, Marvin, I'd like to ask you about the second-hand clothing trade in Ghana. The report notes that the second-hand clothing imports contributed to $35 million to Ghana's GDP in 2023, creating around 14,000 formal jobs. How has this trade transformed local economies? And what can be done to ensure that these benefits are sustainable in the long term?
Thank you for the question. So primarily, the second-hand clothing trade transforms local economies because of the employment opportunities it provides across the value chain when you look at from wholesalers to retailers and down that trajectory. In a country such as Ghana, green jobs are created, especially for the likes of women, because when you look at the demographics, about 52% of the women are involved in the trade. Also, the individuals involved in the trade, 1/3 of them are the youth, and about 65% of individuals involved in the trade are 40 and under, which is extremely huge. There are also indirect jobs that are created. For instance, you're looking at companies involved in logistics, you're looking at seamstresses and tailors, you're looking at drivers of containers of trucks, and what have you. Because in a country such as Ghana, the second-hand clothing trade is a generational business, what you're actually seeing is that each generation is in support of textile circularity. Because at the core of it, we are extending the lifespan of clothes, which limits the purchase of new textiles. And that goes a long way to help lower carbon footprints and reduce water consumption, which comes through the manufacturing of new clothes. And also, most importantly, and what has been mentioned, is the access to quality, affordable clothing, because majority of the Ghanaian population, over 90% of the Ghanaian population, do wear second-hand clothing. Now, when we talk about how to ensure that these benefits are sustainable, we need to make sure and talk about policies, both locally and internationally, that will support the trade to enhance its sustainability. We can also talk about enhanced waste management procedures. We do acknowledge that a country such as Ghana has issues with general waste management. And even though textile waste management is very low in the region of about 2 to 4%, there are still opportunities for us to manage waste in a better way. First and foremost, you can look at educating, especially the informal market traders, because they don't have that much education. By educating them in better ways to manage waste, better ways to dispose of textiles, it will go a long way to help the country in better waste management practices. You can look at other options as providing local recycling infrastructure, which can go and strengthen the sustainability of it as well. It'll go a long way into helping a country such as Ghana. And also, we can look at promoting local entrepreneurship. And this is important because there's an opportunity to encourage innovation within the second-hand clothing value chain through upcycling and customization of second-hand clothing. Local entrepreneurs can actually add value by transforming textiles into new garments, which will help foster business growth. So by addressing these few areas that I've mentioned, Ghana can continue to reap the economic and social benefits of second-hand clothing trade whilst ensuring long-term sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marvin, for your insights on highlighting Ghana's perspective. So before addressing my next question to Peter, I will go back to Philip for a second for the European perspective, because I think it's a good comparison that we also talk about Europe at this point. So as the EU implements more stringent policies on textile waste, such as the Waste Shipment Regulation and Waste Framework Directive that you were also mentioning in your first intervention, there are concerns about the potential impacts on the market, particularly for small sellers and informal sectors in the countries receiving second-hand textiles from the EU. How can the EU ensure that its ambitious textile waste reduction goals support the viability of the second-hand clothing industry? And what role can Europe play in facilitating this balance?
Yeah, thanks for that question, which is super comprehensive, I would say. So many answers to give. I will try to keep it short as possible. But maybe first of all, let me stress that so the waste shipment regulation and also the current revision of the Waste Framework Directive is important again to regulate the waste shipments and actually, in general terms, in order to support the second-hand clothes sector and trade between Europe and Africa, in our case here for this webinar, what we need is really to find a good balance, actually, as a general rule, between not too much administrative burden for sorting operators, but at the same time have efficient rules that are directly tackling the problems. And And here, I would say, first of all, what we should do at EU level, and to bring also some clarity between, on the one hand, the shipments of waste and the shipments of second-hand clothes, is to introduce a clear EU end of waste criteria for textiles reuse. This is really important for us at Zurich, and we would really like to see the process here a bit speed up, especially at the Joint Research Center and then at the European Commission, because we really need this EU end of waste criteria. And the second issue that we should tackle at EU level is also to fight the shipments of waste that is disguised as used clothing. This is really important to fight this phenomenon. And so here again, we need to bring clarity in the picture, so to establish clear criteria again to distinguish between both textile waste and secondhand clothes, so to establish a detailed sorting process prior to any shipment outside Europe. Here, for example, at Zurich, we already developed in 2021 handling and sorting specifications with best practices on how to professionally best sort the textile waste, the used clothing, and to match also the requirements of the importing, the receiving countries. And finally, what I would say is that we need to take into account the whole picture, the whole secondhand clothes trade, and also potential unintended consequences of some regulations that we are taking in the global north to the global south. So here I'm thinking about recent moves within the Basel Convention to change it from some EU member states. Here we should be quite careful about it. Of course, it's important to discuss what we can do on different levels, but always to take into account the whole picture, and not to add too much administrative burden, and not to kill the whole secondhand clothes sector, which is again super environmentally beneficial for everyone. So this is what I would like to say at this point.
Thank you very much, Philip, for your insights. Okay, now Peter, continuing with the reports. Oxford Economics research foresees a significant potential for the formalization of the industry to increase visibility and accountability. What are the key challenges in formalizing these markets, and how can they be supported to ensure decent work and economic inclusion?
Okay, thank you, and also thanks for the invitation to this nice webinar and a very interesting report by Oxford Economics. I think the question about formalization is, I'm not really sure that formalization under all circumstances is a desirable policy objective. The reason is you have to ask yourself, who is going to control the formalization of the sort of informal secondhand clothing trade? If it's the likes of the corporates like, H&M, retailers, Carrefour, others, typically what happens when they enter is that they're seen as having the market power to sort of change a given sector and then formalize, bringing people under their schemes, formalizing work conditions, employees having contracts, et cetera, et cetera. But it also means that a lot of people who are working in the informal sector tend to get pushed out. So that's a real concern, for example, in Bangladesh and post-industrial textile waste, where there's a lot of attempts at formalizing the sector, which is dominated by informal traders and large number of women workers working in the informal sector. So if you want to formalize the sector, I would like to second what Marvin just was saying before. You really need to target it to the MSME sector. So how can you help small and medium-sized enterprises, for example, getting registered as a formal enterprises, getting access to maybe loans, to training, to support schemes, etc. So in other words, you need to, in the MSME sector, you need to meet the entrepreneurs and the workers where they are. That's critical.
Thank you very much, Peter. We appreciate your perspective. Now, let's move forward with socioeconomic impact with a focus on trade. So, Enrique, the second-hand trade between the EU27 plus and countries like Ghana, Kenya, and Mozambique has generated a significant economic value of $46.9 million for direct contribution in the focus countries. and also supporting job creation. What challenges in the trade policies do you think could, what changes in the trade policies do you think could enhance the socioeconomic benefits of this trade, both for the EU and for the African countries?
If I were to think about points that would improve this market, could be to pay attention to import duties on this sector, because higher import duties tend to lead to lower quality items or sourcing from countries where the material is cheaper. So that can have indirect consequences that are delicate to the market. So perhaps countries in the south receiving those products could consider strategies to improve the not revenue connection, not only from the border, so from the harbor and import duties, but also from the markets, by potentially helping entrepreneurs to expand their operations, for example, through e-commerce and digital operations. Another area that I think could deserve attention, that could really help, is to, I think it was already mentioned by Oxford Economics, attention to sorting facilities, right? If there is sorting facilities in Ghana or Kenya or Tanzania, Uganda, I think this would help a lot to also to retain more value of the value chain in those countries and yield more jobs and income. And also to work with the intermediary countries like Pakistan, who perform an important role in the repair and also sorting of clothes before re-exporting to West and East Africa. And finally, the establishment of trade associations, also mentioned by Oxford Economics, is very important. Also to give more advice and substantive support to the diplomats from the Global South active in places like Brussels and Geneva, for example, advising in Basel Convention or EU legislation on this matter.
Thank you very much for highlighting your points. Marvin, moving to you. With 80% of secondhand clothes sold in informal markets in Ghana, affordability is a major reason for the secondhand clothing purchases. What role do you think the secondhand sector plays in providing quality, affordable clothing to low-income populations? And how can this be expanded? And also another hypothetical question, what would be the economic and social impact if secondhand clothing exports from the EU27 plus were halted?
Thank you for the question. So the secondhand clothing trade is crucial to providing quality, affordable clothing to the vast majority of Ghanaians. The trade provides an affordable solution to those that can't afford new clothing, but still seek durable, high-quality garments. For many in Ghana, 90% of the population, as mentioned, are involved in wearing secondhand clothing, and they see secondhand clothing as a way to maintain their basic clothing needs within their low incomes. This shows how important it is to the everyday life of the Ghanaian. Now, to expand on these benefits of the secondhand clothing trade, supporting traders through improved market infrastructure, training programs, and access to finance could enhance the ability to serve even more people while strengthening their businesses. We can go the extra mile by also establishing local recycling plans, which I mentioned a bit in my previous question, or infrastructure for better ways of managing waste. We do acknowledge that a country such as Ghana has issues with general waste management, and even though textile waste as a composition of general waste is at a low level, we can still go a step further into churning out recycled textiles, which may otherwise have been disposed of inappropriately or even end up in landfills. Because the main way in which Ghana, and I know it's similar in other countries, one of the major ways, or the main way, is by disposing of waste to landfills. But by establishing these local recycling plants, we have the opportunity of churning our recycled textiles, which goes a long way to help in the sustainability of the trade. Also, when if we're talking about a hypothetical question of if the EU bans secondhand clothing, it is going to have a detrimental effect both for the global north and for the global south. The reason being that in one aspect, we can look at the prices of clothes soaring. And this will actually hurt the most vulnerable and not give them the opportunity of accessing quality, affordable clothing. We are also risking losing millions in revenue for the country, and countless jobs will be lost as well because of a halt in the second-hand clothing trade. Last but not the least, without the second-hand clothing option, we need to know that clothing is a basic necessity of life. And in whatever way, people need to find clothes to wear. And if the second-hand clothing trade is not there, people are therefore going to resort to cheap, fast fashion, which will rather trickle down into the value chain. And that will have a more detrimental effect on textile quality and on the environment as a whole. So these are the few points that I want to mention in regards to the question that was posed, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marlon, for also highlighting the unintended consequences of potential or hypothetical ban in the future. Peter, turning to you. The report represents a first step in quantifying the socioeconomic impacts of the second-hand clothing industry. What emerging trends or global shifts do you think future research should prioritize to assess the evolving role of the second-hand clothing sector in sustainable development, especially in regions like Africa?
Well, actually, I see it in a slightly broader way, but I see three different trends. The first one is we need to start looking more closely at Europe. All right, so do we have a future for the sort of recycling industry in Europe at all? I mean, why is it that a lot of sort of sorting and grading companies, for example, are moving out to the Middle East, to the UAE, to South Asia, India, Pakistan? Is that the way forward? If that's the way forward, how do we then ensure that that kind of moving out takes place in a socially, environmentally responsible way? I think that's role number one. And I think the priority number one. I think the second priority is continuing to talk about Europe is if we want to retain this kind of industry in Europe, and if it's financially unviable for private sector operators to operate in the industry due to labor costs, due to other competitive challenges, what role does the public sector have in supporting the survival of the industry? If we have to have taxpayers paying, for the sort of sorting, grading, and recycling of used clothing in Europe, then how do we do that at the European level, given that it's not competitive at market rates, apparently? I think the third one is, all right, so we see a gigantic sort of reorganization in the global trade with a lot of used clothing going via the Middle East, via South Asia to East Africa, and other places in Africa and Asia, as well as Latin America. All right, so what I'm wondering is like, okay, who is controlling that trade, and what are the socioeconomic impacts, environmental impacts of that in South Asia and in Africa, particularly in East Africa, and particularly who's controlling the trade in terms of we have a lot of Indians and Pakistanis, or the globalized Indians and Pakistanis that are controlling this trade. I've interviewed some of them. They're all reporting they're doing financially well and running a good business. So what is it that they have that they are able to do? Why does it make business sense for them to run sort of grading and sorting sort of facilities, and also be involved in the trading aspect, when here in Europe we seem to be losing the competitive edge? I think these are critical research questions coming forward. Maybe a fourth priority is, what is China doing on the global stage here? We have very little knowledge and insights about that here in Europe. Why is China emerging as the second largest exporter of used clothing? And who is organizing the trade out of China? What impact does that have in Africa? All right, thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter. Yeah, China was out of the scope of our study, but you're right. They're a very important actor also in the sector, so they should be also kept a close eye on. Thank you very much. So before we move to the Q&A session, I would like to ask one last question to our panelists. Again, please kindly limit your answers to 2 minutes this time each for the interest of time. So my question is, as the second-hand clothing market continues to evolve, how can different stakeholders, including governments, NGOs, traders, private sector, academia, and others, collaborate to improve the sustainability and equitability of the second-hand clothing system? And actually, Peter, we can start with you. So what's your take on this?
Right. I think my take on it is a very basic take. We need access. We need people, to be able to speak to. And very interesting, when I was in the Middle East and in South Asia, I found it much more, in some ways, easy to approach people. Quite open, quite forthcoming, didn't require so much convincing. But I think when we speak to people here in Europe, I think that we have organizations like the BNR and others who can really sort of help reach out, so that researchers like myself and others interested in sort of researching the sector and hopefully also make a contribution in terms of increased knowledge that will help the sector move forward, both in the European continent and South Asia and in Africa. We basically need your help. We need to get people to get in touch. They would like to speak to you. I would love to speak to a lot of people in this sector. But I'm experiencing that it's not everyone who is equally sort of perhaps prepared to open up, maybe for different reasons. But I think that organizations like your own have been very forthcoming, been very much enjoyed also speaking to people from BIR and other places. But there's a real need for openness. So in the sense that we want transparency in the industry, we need the industry actors to also be able to willing to open up and to sort of engage with researchers like myself and also others like Oxford Economics or others who are interested in dwelling more into this area.
Thank you very much. And Philippe, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, but thanks for this question. And actually here I will be quite aligned with what Peter just said. I mean, we need to improve dialogue between all the actors involved, can be NGOs, traders, private sector, as you said, governments, and also EU authorities, EU institutions. So especially the European Commission, who does the law actually at EU level, but also the European Parliament, all the members of the European Parliament that maybe do not have like the whole knowledge of the complex textile value chain and the second-hand clothes sector. So we need to keep the dialogue with everyone, basically, in order to take into account, all the unintended consequences from all the decisions that are taken at EU level. But also, to keep a dialogue with all the stakeholders. What we have at the European Union level, it's already some kind of platforms. We have already the European Circular Economy Stakeholders Platform, which is a forum of exchanges between all the different organizations involved in the textile value chain. So this is something very valuable that we need to continue. And first and foremost, and also because this is the topic of the webinar today, but just to increase the collaboration between the Global North and the Global South, also to improve the discussion with the UN institutions who are taking the lead, also a bit on defining voluntary standards and best practices. So basically to increase the dialogue between everyone. This is my main message.
Thank you very much, Philippe. All clear. I also agree with this. Everyone should be talking to each other and the decisions should be made very, very much informed. I appreciate your thoughts. And Enrique, what's your view?
Except the importation stage, which is formalized, right? Which is in most countries, the trading on the streets is mostly informal. So it's very important for us to demystify this market with data, because informal markets are a black box. So getting data, showing what products are being traded, are they useful, what are the buyers saying, what are the traders saying, and what the products look like. It's very important to really uncover the real socioeconomic impacts. I think the Oxford report goes a good way in that direction. And also to think about the shares that are not being used, right? Because it touches secondhand clothes, just like new clothes, paper, glass, plastics. They touch the issue of materials management and waste management capacity of capitals in the global South, and which are fragile. So action to improve the socioeconomic impacts of secondhand clothes also should consider increasing capacity for mechanical recycling of unused shares, digitalization of these trades. I think there's a lot of opportunity in digitalization of those markets, and also to have structured voices from buyers like Marvin here present, but also other traders associations from across West and East Africa that would really bring a more balanced take to negotiations and policy making in this sector.
Thanks, Enrique. And last but not least, Marvin, over to you.
Okay, so from the perspective of the Global South and in a country such as Ghana, we believe that the likes of the government can play a major role in creating public awareness about the importance of having a circular economy, which is vital now more than ever. In partnership with government, private sector, and international bodies, establishing the likes of local recycling infrastructure will be of great sustainability benefit, as it will help create jobs whilst also reducing waste. And we can even look at the feasibility of the likes of incineration facilities, because in some developed countries, this paves the way of not only reducing waste, but also generating energy for the country. And it will be of great benefit to a country such as Ghana if we have other mediums of generating energy to power residences, commercial and industrial institutions. Last but not the least, educating the informal market traders is very, very important, as they understand better ways of waste management practices. We can also support capacity building of these informal traders by training informal traders and helping them formalize their business and access financing to expand their business as well. So by collectively working together with the respective stakeholders, we can create a more sustainable and equitable ecosystem benefiting both the economy and the environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marlon, and also all of our panelists for your very valuable contribution. We covered some important topics, and I really appreciate you sharing your insights and expertise with us. And now it's time to open the floor to questions from the audience. Again, the audience, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat, and I will be reading some of them out loud to our panelists. And let's get started with our Q&A session. So I already have a question. Actually, there are many questions about about the study and how the informal jobs have been calculated in the country. So Johanna, I think these questions will be for you. So how did you calculate informal jobs in the 3 countries? When you talk about gender parity in all jobs in second-hand clothing in the EU27 plus, how did you calculate this number? And did you base it on surveys or did you use a database? And maybe you could also give more insights about your methodology here. Thank you.
Yes, happy to. So starting with the first question, exactly, I just want to recap. We have importing wholesalers have reported that they sell 80% of the clothing imported to informal market traders. And we came up with a job number because we looked at the International Labour Organization statistics on how much of employment is generated in the wholesale sector in these countries, in the formal and the informal part, because we believe that these official statistics are just the most reliable ones. They have the most comprehensive database. So for each job in the formal economy, which we can track perfectly well with our methodology, we can add up to the percentage that has been reported by the ILO. This was the methodology for the informal parts. Then you asked about how we calculated the women's share, right? So this is based on the surveys we conducted with the major actors involved in each step of the value chain. We also double-checked with literature and official statistics, so to make sure it's plausible, the results. And I think the last question you asked is about what we mean with living wages. So in the EU, we compared it to actual minimum wages, right? Because there are minimum wages as most in the countries imposed. In the Global South, we looked at the poverty lines reported by the World Bank. So we compared the wages with the poverty lines that the World Bank has for these countries, and in the formal sector or in the formal part of the secondhand clothing industry, the salaries earned are higher than these poverty lines. This is our reference point.
Thank you very much, Johanna, for highlighting. Before I move to the next question, I see that there are some hands in the audience, so please, I kindly ask everyone to put your questions down in the Q&A box so that we can streamline their asking. Thank you. So we have another question about second-hand markets. So if more second-hand clothing is sold in the EU, maybe thanks to the circular economy and maybe for the push for the more second-hand options, will the economy in Africa be threatened, sorry, with this? So if anyone wants to jump into this. Yes. Maybe Marlon, what do you think on this? Would you be treated from a Ghana perspective?
So I mean, it depends. So first and foremost, I understand the way in which the second-hand clothing are sold in Europe, and then how it's sold in Ghana and how it goes to the different, let's say, regions or countries, etc. Yeah, to one extent, I mean, I don't believe that all the second-hand clothing can be sold in Europe. That's my first opinion. Definitely, if that is the case, you are going to hinder the opportunity of the likes of African countries having availability and access to quality, affordable clothing. So therefore, that is going to be hindered. You're also going to rather create the opportunity of allowing more fast fashion to trickle down into the value chain, which has a detrimental effect on quality and in the environment as well. And as I mentioned, people would definitely need clothes to wear. So that's what they are going to resort to. But I believe that it is not going to be of benefit to, let's say, export or circulate all the clothing within Europe. I don't think it is a feasible opportunity. I don't think it's viable. I think it's more feasible if you sell the second-hand clothing and involve the African continent in the trade. Thank you.
Thank you for your insights. Does anyone else want to jump into this question?
Could I have a short comment?
Sure. Welcome, Karina.
Just to say, I think there will be a big development in the collection and sorting of secondhand clothes in Europe, and there is a need for a global market. I think what is very important is to have a very clear criteria for good quality for both Africa and for Europe. And I think there is space for both, a need for both. I think to have a circular, competitive economy in textile, we need a global market. And we should just be very careful with giving the right criteria for each product, so we respect the needs, the marketability, and the quality for each market.
Thank you, Karina. Okay. I have another question here about the study. So, Joanna, I guess this will be you. In terms of job creation opportunities gained through imports of second-hand clothing into Africa, we sometimes hear that the sector supports millions of people directly. But the report here indicates that direct employment in each country is in the tens of thousands. Can you explain the difference in these estimates?
Yes, thank you so much for asking that question. I think we discussed that a bit and I touched upon it. So I think there are several factors. Two I mentioned already. So first of all, we only looked at the value or at the contribution of the EU27 plus trade with these countries, so not the overall sector employment. This is the first one. The second one is we do not consider any trade that is channeled via intermediary countries, so it's only directly exported. And we just heard that this is a trend that is going on, and you know that the trade is going through the Middle East. So I think that's also more on the conservative side of estimations, but we couldn't track the trade in particular. So we wanted to rely on the most conservative assumption. And the last part, I think that's the most crucial one when we compare our results to existing studies, is that it's just a different methodology. For example, we only count people who really rely mostly on the secondhand clothing industry as being part of the secondhand clothing industry. So for example, if a farmer sells secondhand clothes to add to his income, we wouldn't count him, but other studies would do. So they just count whoever sells secondhand clothing at some point in time as being part of the industry, but we don't. And we also don't include ancillary workers because we wanted to avoid double counting. So what we really wanted to ensure that we can say this is the share of employment that is really directly supported by the secondhand clothing industry. And this is why we are on the lower and conservative side of estimates, but it's a really rigorous and therefore, consistent approach on calculating the employment. I hope that made it clear.
I'm sure it did. Thank you, Johanna. I'm just scanning through the questions, and there is one more that's coming. So, and I believe this will be the last one. The question is, what should the appropriate regulatory framework that stakeholders are asking should look like? And yeah, if somebody could elaborate on this, maybe could be Enrique or Peter or whoever wants to jump in, please feel free to share your insights with us.
If I can pitch in a line, the appropriate regulatory framework is the one that is constructed with voices from both ends, right? It's exporting and importing end. And what we've seen is that there is probably a bias towards the exporting end, jurisdictions taking decisions with little input from the South.
Thank you very much. And Philippe, from a European perspective, would you like to add something on this?
Yeah, actually here, but this is a bit a repetition from what I said before, but it's just again to bring some clarity about the criteria on how to distinguish between shipments of textile waste and shipments of secondhand clothes, just also to counter the claims that that Europe is exporting textile waste to Africa. Like there was some figures that were echoed by the media depicting a negative picture of the secondhand clothes sector. So in order also to avoid concretely those claims in the future, really need to strengthen those criteria and to bring some clarity. And so in the follow up to the waste shipment regulation, we should also work with the Commission and other institutions in order to establish those detailed sorting process in order to make sure that everyone is exporting only secondhand clothes and not textile waste.
Thank you. And Marvin, I see your camera is turned on. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, just to add on, I think it's important to know that the Waste Framework Directive doesn't hinder what is working appropriately. For example, a lot of the exportation of secondhand clothing, which is coming into Africa and a country such as Ghana, majority of them are already sorted clothing items which are coming. So we need to be able to distinguish between secondhand clothing that is coming and textile waste which is coming through, because majority, about 95% of the clothing that we are importing into a country such as Ghana is sorted clothing items. I think I raised a similar concern at the BIR conference, which I was part of, because if clothing are already sorted, then really the Waste Framework Directive should not come and have any adverse effect on it. If we're talking about unsorted clothing, which when we mention originals or tropical mix, then yeah, we can have better framework directives which can support it, but not clothing items which are already sorted, which are coming to countries such as Africa. So it needs to be clear on what the waste framework directives are, or the policy or the regulations are upon. Is it sorted clothing? Are we talking about textile waste? Are we talking about unsorted clothing? Are we talking about tropical mix? So all these need to be clear, and it's important that we don't bundle all into one, because otherwise you're going to hinder something which is already working well in a country such as Ghana and in the global south. Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess here the end of waste criteria also steps in as a very important factor. Peter, would you like to add some points?
Yeah, just following up on the very nice point that Marvin just made, I think it's important to distinguish between different types of goods that are being traded, or whether it's goods or waste, and different categories of waste and goods, etc. But also, I think a very important point is to look at what is the existing infrastructure in countries that are importing used clothing. So, for example, in India and Pakistan, where I have studied, sort of used clothing imports and re-exports in the last year or so, they have very strong, vertically integrated textile and garment value chains already, which to some extent allows them to convert used clothing into thread through forms of mechanical recycling, which are used in the manufacturing of jeans, for example, but also in sort of manufacturing of home textiles. So I think there's a very big difference between some of the countries we see in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And sometimes we need to go on a country-by-country basis. It becomes very hard to generalize in general sort of what should be done in importing countries regarding waste shipments or shipments of used clothing. It really depends upon what does the situation in that particular country look like.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your insights. And with this note, I would like to end our panel and hand over to Karina. But first of all, I also would like to say that thank you all of you for joining us, and thank you all of the audience for sharing your questions with us. Unfortunately, we couldn't treat them all today, but I hope that you still had some answers both from the panelists' discussions and also the presentation that Johanna was sharing with us earlier. And I wish you all a good day. And over to you, Karina.
Thank you, Etche. Thank you, everybody. So I will try to make a short summary. First of all, a very, very interesting presentation. What I think we can take away with us for sure is the second-hand clothes sector is a vital part of future circular textile economy. And it is stimulating billions of dollars in GDP contribution and supporting thousands of green jobs across Europe and Africa. I will not repeat all the numbers, but just remember 7 billion total contribution to the EU and UK's GDP in 2023, 110,000 green jobs directly in the industry. If we go to Africa, there are millions of dollars of tax contribution and for formal and informal jobs. You have the more details in the report when you go to each of the countries which were included in the report. It's worth to especially underline that many of their jobs are created for people with limited formal education, and more than 70% are women. And this has a strong also power elevation function with second-hand clothes in many of those countries. Many interesting comments from the speakers. So what could we take away? I will try to summarize. We could hear the difficulties in the sector and the need of support in this phase of transition. There is need to grow the reuse sector to keep the positive impact for the sector that is playing a very, very important role. The waste shipment regulations, there is needed clear rules, but without bureaucracy. And we heard about the definition criteria for second-hand clothes as very important for the end of waste, so we can distinguish reusable products from whatever could be considered waste. It was interesting to hear that the data also from Uganda and Kenya, from the UN Trade and Development, from Henrique Pacini, where he could also mention that there is less than 4% of the items considered not reusable. We heard from the Ghana Trade Association, with a large number of traders which are depending on the import of second-hand clothes from Europe and UK. And these are crucial for having affordable clothes with high quality. And actually more than 80% of the people in Ghana is wearing second-hand clothes. We heard from Peter Land, Thomas. The approach has to be global. We should not be too biased and start to think that everything is starting in Europe. We have to look at the global situation. We have to create a global competitive circular economy, and we should not underestimate the capacity outside Europe. I think all those comments actually were repeated by many of the speakers. Of course, we would like to come up with some policy recommendation, and what I could take away from what has been said, it is that it's important to implement and enforce the EPR scheme. It is urgent to make it happening, and it is also important to underline that the importance of the eco-contributions to be on the new apparel on the European market, stimulating the reuse. Again, develop the clear end-of-waste criteria for textiles. This is for Europe. For the South, support the affordability of second-hand clothes by lowering import taxes and second-hand clothes surcharges. Encourage the establishment of local sorting centers, and for sure, develop effective recycling and waste management infrastructure in general. Saying all this, there are many, many things more to say. I will not say it. You will have all access to the report using the QR code. And I don't know, yes, it's on the line. Yes, good. We really hope that you will follow us. You can follow Humana People to People and Sympany on the social media, on LinkedIn, on X. You are very welcome to contact us if you need any more information. And thank you, everybody. Thank you, a big, big thank you for all the speakers, the contributions. Thank you to Oxford Economics for this report and the study done. Thank you to all for keeping the attention until the very end of this webinar.